This is Counterpoint.
It's the November 7th edition of Counterpoint. I'm Joshua Goodman with Roland Freudenstein of the Center for European Studies, Jan Techau of Carnegie Europe, and Sir Michael Leigh of the German Marshall Fund. He's just rolled his eyes. I think the last time you were on the show was right before you were being knighted, so we thought we'd bestow the honor upon you, as the Queen did.
We can't do it the same way.
No, we can't. I don't have a sword on me. But the big news is not that we have a knight at the table, is that we finally know, after months of speculation and intense debate, who will be occupying the White House for the next 4 years. The American people have spoken, and the winner is Barack Obama.
Tonight, more than 200 years after a former colony won the right to determine its own destiny, the task of perfecting our union moves forward. It moves forward because of you. It moves forward because you reaffirmed the spirit that has triumphed over war and depression, the spirit that has lifted this country from the depths of despair to the great heights of hope, the belief that while each of us will pursue our own individual dreams, we are an American family, and we rise or fall together as one nation and as one people.
At last count, incumbent Barack Obama beat challenger Mitt Romney by 303 electoral votes to 206, with Florida still undecided, as Obama's lead there is only around 45,000 for forcing a recount to take place. But regardless of the outcome of that, the final result is still settled. In the Senate, the Democrats hung on to the majority, while the Republicans did the same in the House of Representatives. The popular vote paints a much closer picture than the Electoral College, a separation of about 2.5 million votes, or 2% in favor of Obama. Now, there's still a few votes to be counted, and obviously those who casted their ballots from abroad, some of them may not have arrived by now. But Roland, I'll start with you. Were you surprised by the result?
Not really. Although there were fears that there would be recounts, and we know both camps had their lawyers ready, and there was a fear for some days that it would be a 2000 revisited, when for a short time the world felt that the major Western power is paralyzed by a constitutional struggle about the presidency. Now, this has not happened. Democracy has spoken, indeed. And the result is, to some people, surprisingly clear. So it's 4 more years. And I admit I had some mixed feelings about this morning when I got up and looked at the results on the internet.
So you didn't stay up for the election results?
No, I woke up at 2:30 and looked at the internet briefly, saw that nothing was in yet, and then went back to sleep, and then around 5 or so I saw that it was clear.
Yeah.
So it's, aside from the speculation what would have happened to American foreign policy, because that's what we're mainly interested in here, what would have happened to American foreign policy in case of a Romney victory, to me, I am critical of a few key points in Obama's foreign policy. So the feeling was like, 4 more years of that.
But we'll get to those points in the next segment. Jan, were you surprised at all, or was this something you expected? And if so, what were the reasons why you expected a comfortable Obama victory?
Yeah, I went to bed as well because I didn't expect this to be a tight race at all. This was all the craze before last night, that it was such a tight race, and it wasn't. And when you looked at the numbers over the last few months, I really only checked once a week or so, but then there was never really a constellation in the numbers that indicated that Romney had a chance of becoming president. And the argument that those numbers were kind of structurally biased against him because they were based on 2008 calculations, that never sounded credible to me, because this is the most refined polling business in the world out there in the US. And to go wrong over such a long, protracted period of time in such a structural way would be highly unusual. So I expected this to happen. I have mixed feelings as well. The record is weak. and the fact that he got reelected, is given the overall record of what he has achieved and the state of the economy, and so on and so forth, to a certain extent a surprise, but also a testament of how weak Romney as a candidate was.
The electoral number, and this based on the electoral college system, makes the victory seem much more resounding than the popular vote, which, as I said, was 2%.
Well, that's part of the election system.
Right, of course. In the swing states, the polling numbers seemed, we discussed them last week, the polling numbers seemed about the same, some of them putting Romney just a little bit ahead. So one could assume that then there was this general shift back to Obama that was pretty consistent in those states. Was there, for any of you, one factor that might have caused voters or the average voter in those states and in general in the U.S. to suddenly say, well, maybe even though I've been saying I'll vote Romney, maybe I'll vote Obama now?
That's so hard to say. I mean, last time we talked about Hurricane Sandy as a classical moment of the executive, where the challenger has to do everything right and can only hope to maintain the balance, whereas the executive, the incumbent, has huge chances to improve his reputation. But that was not all. I mean, I do think that one argument that was forwarded during the day today was the car industry, which in Michigan and Ohio, two important swing states, does play a role. And the bailout that happened for General Motors, that may have played a role. And then I just think the Denver factor, which was the first presidential televised debate in which Romney clearly won. I think the Denver factor was just wearing off. If the election
it came too soon.
Denver came too soon, or the election came too late, whichever way you would have put it. But if it had happened 2 weeks, if the election had happened 2 weeks after Denver, there might have been a possibility.
Michael, is there a factor that stood out for you?
Well, with the unemployment figures being what they are, the election to some extent was Romney's to lose. And I think he lost it in part because in the final weeks, Obama was really able to point out clearly the many contradictions and shifts in the position that Romney had been taken, and above all, that his budget figures simply didn't add up.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, if you could choose one thing that the Romney campaign should have done differently, what would it have been? And you mentioned a couple factors there. It was Romney as the inconsistencies in policies, or questions about the budget, or as Roland said, Hurricane Sandy. But if there was, because it was in essence a close vote at 2%, it's not that resounding a victory. And when you look at the swing states, the vote was very close there. What was, do you think, the factor that really at the last minute ensured, or overall, what was that factor that caused the candidate Obama to surpass that of Romney?
I think there's not a single factor that I would single out in this case. One major flaw. I think this was an exceptionally weak candidate from the beginning, was never fully supported, with full heart by his own camp. And they squeezed the utmost out of him, to the extent that this guy could be played and sold. They played and sold him. Okay. And so this was, I think, the maximum that could have been reached with this guy. The problem is that the Republican field from the beginning, even the primaries, was extremely weak. He was certainly the best candidate of the bunch, but there was not much more that they could have done with this guy.
So would Romney have been better off, instead of catering to the core of the Republican Party, or not even the core, but you can debate what the core of the Republican Party is, but the far right and the Paul Ryan camp of the party, would he have been better off staying as Mitt Romney the governor? Would he have been possibly more successful? I
mean, he became Mitt Romney the governor again later on when he had to move to the center, but this is the impossible task every American presidential candidate has to go through. He has to move to the fringes in the primaries, and then he has to move back to the center for the re-election. And for Romney tried this. In his case, that was flip-flopping for many.
It worked too well, is what you're saying, right?
Had he played the governor from the beginning, I think that would have been a better chance for him. But, then he would probably not have gotten their nomination to begin with. So a dilemma in any case.
But if in the case of the Republicans, is the presence of the Tea Party, and whether it's organized or not, and they claim to be not organized, but some say they are, but the presence of a very strong faction, does it make it more difficult then for the Republican candidate than for for a Democratic candidate who does have to reach out to his extreme, but it's maybe not as strong as, and doesn't field a group of candidates in the way that that the Republicans do? Is it a more difficult task?
He certainly had difficulty in persuading voters in the center that he was a moderate after the early positions he'd taken intended to appeal to the Tea Party. But at this stage, I think we see the influence of the Tea Party much diminished. And although there will be reproaches from those on the right that he lost the election because he didn't develop their theses sufficiently strongly, I have the feeling that their moment has come and gone.
I think there's something very interesting happening in the United States. It's very untypical from a European perspective. Here in Europe, we are kind of used to the fact that it's the left that is splintered and infighting, and that the right
has some really, really rabid radicals.
Absolutely, and that
spoken like a true
the right
conservative, Roland.
and the political right is kind of more consolidated. In the U.S., it's the other way around. It's the left that's fairly consolidated, and it's the right that produces one movement after the next. First, it was the religious right, then it was the neocons, now it's the Tea Party. Over the last 10 years, this Republican Party was extremely productive in creating splinter groups and new movements. So the entire debate about what is conservative in the United States, what does it stand for, what do Republicans want to be, is extremely vibrant, and that makes it difficult for any candidate in that field to consolidate the movement and bring everybody on board. And I think this is what we also saw with Romney.
Just to add a word to that, just take one issue which in Europe is associated always with the extreme right, namely immigration, and particularly being tough on immigration. On the contrary, in the United States, George Bush was able to cash in considerably on his pro-Hispanic position, and a lot of business in the United States is pro-immigration and even tolerant of illegal immigration because it means cheap labor. So the cards just fall rather differently on these issues than they do in Europe.
One of the comments that I noticed I too did not stay up to watch the results, so I can't boast about being the young one at the table who had the fortitude to stay awake.
You are the young one at the table.
I am still the young one at the table for now. But one of the comments that Eddie and I frequently heard as we were preparing the show was that the Republicans are going to have to rethink their whole party, and this could be a moment where they have to almost a renaissance for the Republican Party. Is there one issue you can point to specifically that they have to rethink if they're going to gain more of the mainstream center support?
Yes, I think it certainly is the budget question that Michael just pointed out. The figures have to add up, and they didn't in the run up to this election, and that's one of the things that the whole economic and social policy cluster that the Republicans have to get right. But on the other hand, the finger pointing will start, the blame game will start now in the Republican Party, and we're going to see a lot of infighting. Although I do not believe what some European commentators said, that now this is the time when the Republicans could split. I think that's seeing it from maybe a very Italian or French or other continental point of view, but certainly not from a British or German view, where we have very, very stable political parties, and I don't see a split in the Republican Party. I see maybe a paralysis. I see a certainly painful process of working on the outcome of this election, but I don't see a realignment of the U.S. party system.
Michael?
Just as Obama is going to have to reach out now to Republicans in Congress to avoid the famous fiscal cliff, the automatic cuts in spending and increase in taxation that will occur unless there's an agreement, the Republicans too are going to have to step back from their position that they will not accept 1 extra cent in taxation. Some compromise is absolutely necessary for both sides.
Well, the Republicans, we spoke of a rethink. The Republicans, one aspect that people are pointing to is that they have a very young core and a lot of up-and-coming stars who will probably take advantage of the opportunity to push to the top and to take power.
With that in mind, I think they are not going to want to take responsibility for the fiscal cliff.
Right.
If it looks as though Republican obstructionism has led to this disastrous development, they will carry the can for that, and they know it. So I think this will be an incentive, particularly for new members of Congress, to see the need for some degree of compromise.
It could be an interesting struggle then between these new members, these young members, even the Paul Ryans and John Boehner, if he is returned as Speaker of the House.
Yeah, and some non-congressional Republicans,
right,
like governors who want to have a chance of becoming president
like
at some point.
Bobby Jindal of Louisiana
or
comes
Chris
to mind.
Christie.
Is Chris Christie's? I have to ask: Is he? Does he have an unlikely future in the Republican Party because he endorsed President Obama?
No, he certainly has a future. He's a great political talent. He's the real thing. Voters love him for it. There might be a little bit of a grudge over his sandy management where he had to embrace Obama. But everybody, who's not a complete fool must understand that a governor, has the task of dealing with such a disaster and that he needs to work with the federal government, whoever is in office. So I think he did the right thing. In the end, I think, once the dust has settled and once the ideological battles are over within the Republican Party, he stands a very good chance of being something. Maybe not president, but potentially president. You never know.
I still bet on Marco Rubio.
Do you? We're going to hold you to that if you're still on the show in 4 years. If we're all on
that's a scary thought.
If we're all on the air in 4 years. The election campaign was very much focused on domestic issues. Pushed aside was foreign policy, but they may have ignored them during the campaign, but those issues continue to evolve and in some cases worsen, and now the president and Barack Obama has to deal with them and re-engage on these issues. We're going to turn to what Barack Obama's foreign policy priorities should be after this short break. You're listening to Counterpoint. Welcome back. As I said before the break, by all accounts, the U.S. election was about the economy, so foreign policy took a back seat. With President Obama now having succeeded in his re-election bid, he must extend his focus to issues beyond his border. Jan, what is the top foreign policy issue for President Obama right now?
I think there are probably three things that he's losing sleep over. The first one is definitely Syria and, the explosiveness of the region and how that could potentially turn into a spillover kind of effect there. And that leads us to Iran, which is the second thing that had been put on ice a couple of months back. It will now re-emerge in one way or another. There will be elections in Israel soon, during which Iran will feature prominently. There's going to be elections in June of next year in Iran.
Right. And Israel's elections are at the end of January.
Yes. And then the third one I think that's on the list is, the new China. We will have a new leadership in China soon, in about 2 weeks' time. We know all of the people that will be in office. We know nothing about them and what they want to do. There's infighting in the Communist Party in China. Staying in power is the preeminent objective of these people. And what that will lead to in terms of their foreign policy kind of activities, we don't know. So these three things I'd single out.
We talked about Syria in depth last year and the danger and not really a good option on the table scenario that it's become. So let's turn to Iran. There were reports during the election cycle that President Obama would pursue direct negotiations. A report, I think it might have been in the New York Times, emerged this week saying that Valerie Jarrett, who is not a foreign policy advisor of President Obama but is very close to the president, had actually established direct dialogue with the Iranians, but it was not confirmed by the administration or by any other source.
Something came out of Israel today, I think, some kind of a newswire thing that I saw, that somebody there, official, said that there could possibly be direct negotiations.
So Michael or Roland, in that context, what is the first step for Obama then?
Well, I mean,
not perhaps, Roland, what you would like the first step to be, but what do you see the first step?
Oh, you're talking about the strike? No,
no.
No, seriously speaking. No, I think, I mean, these direct talks, however clandestine or open they were, I could only see a sense in them if they lead to Iran abandoning the nuclear program, which is again a possibility that I don't really see. So I don't know what they're talking about.
You don't think the P5+1 will make a grand offer to the Iranians?
Oh, they've made grand offers in the past. Mm-hmm. Maybe they weren't grand enough.
I think there's an offer in the making. I think there's something coming.
There's something coming that will include what? There's
something coming, and it will probably include some kind of recognition of enrichment up to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. That's just my feeling, and for two reasons. Because first of all, this would put immense pressure on the Iranians domestically, who already have a pretty big debate internally about what course to take. And the second reason is that if you now, with a new mandate as the American president, come out with an offer publicly for all of the world that sounds reasonable, strict enough but reasonable and kind of acceptable, and then say no from the Iranian position, you're losing most of your credibility. And that is the precondition for a military escalation. I don't think that there could be a military escalation without another offer
So
first.
it's something they can live with, but if the Iranians don't, that's the final straw.
The pressure will be immensely high, and when they say no, then there will be a lot. The credibility of a military escalation will be a lot higher. So I think psychologically, even though that offer might not be accepted, it's important to build up to whatever comes afterwards, and to have a credible kind of case, to have plausible deniability, if you will, for a military escalation.
Right. But Jan, has Iran ever said no? Have they ever clearly said no? They've said yes, we can talk. And they're going to say the same thing this time. And
I think they have turned down offers. Yeah, I think the
I
EU
think they've
always
said
has
no.
the EU always says we have an offer on the table, and the Iranians won't even engage
not
on it,
all
which
about
is essentially
gaining
saying
time.
no.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is the gaining time argument that you're making.
I think we've been there before.
Even if we have been there before, this is now a new situation. There was an understanding that nothing would happen while the Americans were still bogged down in the campaign. Now the situation is clearer, is newer, and the situation in Iran has deteriorated considerably. The currency has gone down the drains, and there's now an inquiry. The parliament is actually giving Ahmadinejad a hard time, and the guardians of the revolution also giving him a hard time. And so there are in ways all of a sudden that we probably didn't have half a year ago or a year ago. So why not give it a new chance? There's not going to be a military escalation. I mean, Netanyahu has overplayed his cards. That's off the table for the moment. So give it a new start and then see where it goes. I'm not against that.
So far it seems a lot of the focus, and you got that sense from the foreign policy debate, a lot of the focus is put on the Middle East, and for everyone, a lot of focus on the Middle East being Syria, being Iran, less so the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, perhaps because of lack of progress. But Jan, you mentioned China, and that brings up the question I'll ask you, Michael. Are there other regions the president might focus on? There's always an attempt to engage South America. There's the looming re-emergence of Russia. Or are we already at the point where Russia has emerged? And where do you think the president may actually look elsewhere than the Middle East, which seems very difficult to solve?
The foreign policy debate was striking partly because of the issues that were not mentioned. Very significant parts of the world figured in no way in this debate. Europe, I think, was not mentioned. South America was not mentioned. India was not mentioned. Africa was not mentioned. There was very little discussion about Asia Pacific other than China. And yet, I think there are pressing issues that the United States needs to address, and there are also opportunities. And I don't think the circle around the president should advise that he focus only on these half-dozen top issues that we've already mentioned. I think there are also opportunities in the Asia-Pacific area and also in South America. People are actually looking increasingly to the United States and indeed to some degree to Europe to play a more active role, partly because of the rise of China. Now, I'm not suggesting there should be any kind of anti-China alliances formed, but there is a feeling, whether in trade, investment, or presence, involvement in some of the current issues such as climate change, that New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, for that matter, South Africa, Nigeria, would like to hear rather more from the United States on the issues that are important to them.
How realistic is it then that President Obama will actually look beyond the Middle East and the what I guess we could call the core issues that the U.S. presidents tend to focus on?
Well, I just very simply guess that this will largely depend on who becomes a Secretary of State. And I'm not venturing a guess here, but that's a figure that will play a role in exactly these questions of what else to address as priority number 4, 5, or 6.
Does President Obama need a foreign policy victory right away? Does he need something, an easy win? No. It can be superficial, it can be substantive, but do you get the sense he needs? And I ask this in the context of, towards the end of the election campaign, the Republicans really pushed on this alleged Benghazi cover-up, a cover-up on what actually happened in Benghazi in the attacks on September 11th of this year. They could, with control of the Congress, push even further on that, and to try in an effort to also earn some points and perhaps distract from the partisanship that you all suspect might happen over the budget issue. Does President Obama need to then, in turn, when they're diverting attention, then redivert attention to something else by making progress in some field?
Two brief remarks. One, Benghazi, of course, was played up by the Republican side precisely to counter the aura of able leadership willing to take risks that Obama gained in the killing of Osama bin Laden. I mean, that's for sure. There was like the Republican counterpoint to the killing of bin Laden. Now, but behind Benghazi, there is a larger question looming, of course, which is how to deal with those people in the Middle East that really don't like us. How to engage with people that want to engage us only in the third meaning of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is to open fire or open hostilities.
But that's a difficult issue, and that also brings the conversation back to the Middle East. But is there a chance President Obama is going to look elsewhere to find something to make some progress on? And is there an issue that's, that in American vernacular, it's when you play baseball, but you throw one right across the plate, it's like lobbing a beach ball across the plate to the batter. Is there a beach ball he can swing at?
A transatlantic free trade area?
Oh,
yeah, that would be that's fantastic. That would be great, but that's not low-hanging fruit. Nope. I think we're asking here for low-hanging fruit.
That's exactly it.
And foreign policy is not really about that much, I guess. I mean, what really matters for him domestically, and I guess this is the question you're asking, is domestic success. I mean, he needs to resolve the budget issue. He needs to do something about unemployment. He needs to assure people that he can handle the crisis better than he did in the last 4 years. This is what's ultimately going to count, and not some kind of low-hanging foreign policy fruit.
So do you really think then, I throw this to all of you, to follow up on that, do you think foreign policy is going to continue to play, to be second fiddle to the economy, or when you factor in the economy, healthcare, and all the other issues in America, because we can break down the economy into 12 issues, but do you think it's really low on the totem pole?
There is a feeling that with the economy in the state that it is, the fiscal cliff looming, that foreign policy is a luxury. But as somebody once pointed out, stuff happens. Or as one British Prime Minister said when commenting on what influences policymakers, events, dear boy, Harold Macmillan. And therefore, I think that events will occur as a result of what's taking place now in Syria and the possible panicked reaction of Hezbollah at the thought of losing its resupply route and its ally in Syria. Nobody can guess at what their reaction might be. And I think the rather comfortable feeling that is quite prevalent in Israel, to some extent also in the United States, that the status quo can go on more or less indefinitely, might not be proved correct. And if the president decided at the start of his period of office, with 4 years in front of him, that the Middle East was after all a priority, even if there's no crisis looming at the moment, I believe there's a lot that he could achieve.
Well, there is some time for the president to engage on the Middle East issue and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because there is technically, Israel's in the election cycle right now, so that can wait till February, and by then we will certainly have the new Secretary of State, and we won't ask, unless Hillary Clinton is going to surprise everyone and come back, but we won't ask Roland for his prediction. Michael, you mentioned earlier the question of Europe. Europe is one area where you could say the economy and foreign relations interconnect quite intimately, and that is Europe's relations with the EU and its member states. We'll explore the transatlantic component of the second Obama term when we return from this short break. You're listening to Counterpoint. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The EU as a whole presents the US's largest trading partner, so there is obvious concern over the continued financial crisis in Europe. Transatlanticists will also argue that Europe is America's most natural ally, and there are numerous examples in the annals of history to that effect. All this suggests an important, if not at times intimate, relationship. Let's start there. Looking back at the first Obama administration, Michael, how do you assess the transatlantic relationship over the past 4 years?
When we think back even to the period before Obama became president, he had already been plebiscited in Europe. I think we remember his speeches in Germany, the huge turnout when he was still a candidate.
That was at the Brandenburg Gate, if I'm not
No,
mistaken.
the
Oh,
Siegessäule,
oh, sorry.
the victory column.
Oh, okay.
So there's no doubt, as we saw also just before the present election, that had the election taken place in France, Romney might have got 2% of the vote, that throughout Europe, in fact, there has been this groundswell of support for Obama. The question is this unrequited love? And some feel that during the last 4 years, he's done relatively little to reciprocate this display of emotion and support. The German Marshall Fund runs a huge opinion survey every year. And last year, it was apparent that public opinion in the United States had tilted decisively towards believing that American interests were more at stake in Asia than in Europe, following Obama's own famous pivot towards Asia.
Is that true? Are Americans' interests more grounded in Asia than in Europe?
Well, I think, if we Europeans complain about the unreturned love for Obama, we have ourselves to blame too. There is something very, very contradictory in our approval of Obama. I mean, we all know that the motivation for this Obama cult in Europe is partly to avoid even worse options in European eyes. But okay, you see, Europe hasn't done very much in the last 4 or 8 or even 12 years to deserve more attention from the U.S. administration or the American people, because Europe looks like a bunch of clowns that can't agree on anything, at least not fast enough, and that can't get their act together. And, as much as some European observers and commentators before the U.S. election this time said that no matter who wins, America is doomed, and Obama may be a good guy, but he's a victim of Wall Street and the Tea Party and the system. In the same vein, you had Americans, not only conservatives, turning away in disgust from a Europe which they said is only reinforcing its own irrelevance.
Well, I think the Economist, when it endorsed Obama, and I put endorse in quotes because it basically said
Came
that
pretty late.
both of them are terrible, but we actually know him, so we know what we're going to get.
But it came very late.
But is that symptomatic of the relationship? And as you described, where both sides, really, when it gets down to its core, at least at the political core, aren't interested? I mean, if that's the case, then Jan, how does this relationship improve moving forward?
I think I agree with Roland. It's in our court, the ball. I mean, we have our homework to do. The quality of transatlantic relations will depend on what we make of it, less of what Obama or the U.S. makes of it. And if we get our act together, both in terms of the crisis and in terms of our foreign policy ineptitude, then they'll look at us and take us more serious. And by the way, this is not just about pleasing America, that we have to get our act together to please them in some way. It's about, protecting our own interests and, if push comes to shove, to have at least a modicum of influence over the Americans in their decision making. And so it's completely in our interest. We have... I'm not sure that we look like a bunch of clowns. There's also a structural difficulty in making EU foreign policy that should not be overlooked. It's not easy. We're not one actor. So give the Europeans some credit for the fact that they're just a diverse bunch. But at the same time, it's very clear that we have to do a lot more, not only in the military field, but also in terms of being intellectually invested in the big questions in the world and putting stuff on the table. So I think we have our homework to do, and that will improve transatlantic relations.
Michael, how do you improve transatlantic relations?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to perhaps rebalance the discussion a little bit, looking back at the last 4 years. I think one of the reasons why Americans in the past did not see Europe as so important anymore, particularly vis-à-vis Asia, is because Europe poses no main security challenges to the United States. Most of the problems the United States faces are in Europe. Some residual problems in Bosnia or Kosovo, perhaps, but U.S. security interests are not really at stake in Europe itself. I agree fully that we need to show that we can do the heavy lifting, particularly in our own environment, But there too, I think the picture is perhaps somewhat mixed. There are also positive side to it. When it comes to Iran sanctions, in any event, I think implementation has been something where the Europeans have gone ahead. And if we look at Libya, which occurred during this period as well, in which Obama famously led from behind, certainly the American involvement was crucial, but it was Europe who was up there in front, or rather European countries.
So let me then ask as a follow-up, when you say our environment, speaking of Europe's environment, is North Africa the test? Because it is part of Europe's neighborhood. Is this where, and America's been pretty hands-offish with North Africa. Even at times, I think Hillary Clinton said, we need our partners to take the lead in some places. And as you point to, Libya was a good example of that. But does North Africa then become Europe's first test to prove itself as a co-leader in global affairs?
I think, yes, North Africa, the Middle East, and also Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. We've just had elections in Ukraine. Ukraine is in a kind of no man's land. And Europe needs to show now the creativity and imagination to engage Ukraine.
Yeah, well, let me just briefly return to the Middle East. I do think that here's an area where I would like to see just more transatlantic coordination. And that is not happening for many reasons. Partly there's probably a lack of a forum to do so. But there's also one factor that we shouldn't leave out here, which is that after the Arab revolutions, there is a strong tendency of some Europeans to bask in this sunlight of America, in most countries except for Libya, being the underdog and being the most distrusted nation. And that creates the temptation for Europeans to actually dissociate themselves from the United States, trying to gain rubber points with the so-called Arab street. I think that's a dangerous development. It's a very short-sighted development because precisely we need to do heavy lifting, but the best way to do so is together with our American friends and allies. And if we find any advantage in dissociating ourselves from the Americans and telling the Arabs that look how un-American we are, that won't get us anywhere. So that's one thing. And on Eastern Europe. Again, I would like to see more of a coordinated effort between Europe and America.
Well, you all seem to point to foreign policy issues as the areas where cooperation can improve. One thing that stuck out to me from the last few days of the campaign was there was a comment from President Obama about not letting Spain default, not letting Spain collapse, and the importance of that. Is there an economic element to this? Is it, given that Europe is altogether, when you put the EU all together, America's #1 trading partner, separately 3 nations, I believe, Germany, England, and maybe the Netherlands are in the top 5, Canada being the top, then China, and then I think they follow after. But the importance is clear. Shouldn't the focus be on the economics, on making sure that helping Europe recover from its financial crisis?
When you talk to Americans at the moment in Washington, what Michael said is right. They don't look at us as a foreign policy problem, but they do look at us as an economic problem. They fear our instability. They fear the inability to get the crisis kind of under control. They fear the spillover it might have on them. So that is the
Europeans fear that too.
They fear that too. I mean, but there's a realistic assumption over there that that this is something that not only matters to the Europeans but has profound relevance for them. And so this is the backbone of it all. I mean, we can afford none of these grandiose foreign policy ideas if we don't get this thing on track again. So obviously, this is the primary kind of or the first kind of priority. But this is also what politicians are doing. They're dealing with this almost exclusively at the moment, not doing too much foreign policy on the side, to the utter chagrin of us who watch foreign policy all the time. So I think definitely the economy first. The problem is that we have to do many of these foreign policy things at the same time. We can't sequence them. So it's very tricky.
Right, and that comes back to a comment Michael made where you can plan all you want to focus on the economy, but foreign play, it's the unknown that just pops up, and that seems to happen. The Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening is a perfect example of that. No one saw that coming. But with regards to the economy, the next European Council Summit is in a few weeks, I think the 20-something of November, and we'll be following that closely here. We're going to wrap up the show after this break, and when we do that, we'll look at what stood out most over the campaign and the election. You're listening to Counterpoint. Welcome back to Counterpoint. Some commentators have mentioned the overly nasty nature of the campaign, which bred a degree of fatigue. In fact, there was a YouTube video of a conversation between a young girl and her mother, which went viral to the tune of over 13 million viewers in about a week, that may speak to this perception. Now have a listen.
Just because I'm tired of Barack Obama and Mitt Romney.
That's why you're crying? Oh, it'll be over soon, Abby. Okay? The election will be over soon, okay?
Okay.
Oh.
Well, did any of you experience election fatigue? Perhaps not to the point of tears, but was there a sense that let's just get this over with? Michael?
First of all, the great length of the campaign. Mm-hmm. The fact that the last year and a half of a 4-year term of office was dominated by the campaign, and the inevitable gross simplification of the issues that involved, and the fact that the debate on the economy, which is absolutely crucial, did not really address the realities, but rather symbolic issues that had resonance with the different constituencies of the two candidates. This, to me, was tremendously disappointing.
Roland, anything that really bothered you in the campaign?
Roland likes red meat.
I do, yeah. I mean, although the political symbolism of colors in the States always bothers me because it's exactly the reverse in most European
everywhere
contexts.
else, even in Canada too.
Yeah, well, I should. But no, I mean, you know, I wasn't a victim. But I think of the poor Ohioans who really had to bear the brunt of like especially the intense last weeks. And you know, I mean, it's annoying enough for a European watching an American TV show and it being interrupted every 10 minutes by commercials. But I mean, then these were election commercials, probably. You know, and also the negative campaigning. It would get on my nerves if I was an American citizen. But you know, here sitting comfortably in a Brussels radio show, I don't feel victimized.
What about the amount of money spent on the elections? According to PBS NewsHour, Romney and Republican groups spent more than $550 million US, and Obama and his allies $381 million. Jan, do you think this is something that people will discuss in post-election, particularly in a time of economic crisis where they're speaking about the need to reduce spending and decrease the deficit? And here you have $1 billion going to ads on television that apparently tired everyone out.
I mean, it's two things maybe about this. One, it's completely mind-bogglingly insane, and second, it's probably not going to be changeable. Because this is the way it's organized over there. We have ever since they got rid of the smoke-filled back rooms and have transparent pre-selection processes and primaries, in other words. This is a protracted process, lasts forever. The stakes are ever higher, and there are ever more people interested in specific outcomes, so more money is being fed into this. And the more money is being fed into it on the one hand, you know, the more it needs to be fed in on the other side. So it's basically a game that cannot really ever end, you know, save of some structural change to the system, which I don't see, you know, coming. To the contrary, the Supreme Court, in his famous decision on super PACs, you know, allowed for for corporate donations and for indirect donations to an unprecedented way, you know, made that part of the free speech, part of the American Constitution. So all floodgates are open. I don't see how this can ever change. The one thing that bothers me more than the money is the one thing that Michael just mentioned, the fact that this is just taking forever and that it overshadows all reasonable policy debates for a significant chunk of anybody's presidency. That makes no sense and is deeply dysfunctional.
Michael, final word?
Yes, as we're approaching the end of the show, it would be good to end on a partly positive note. And I think it's striking that for all the hype concerning the Republican super PAC money and the huge total sums spent during the election, some considered $6 billion all in all, the spending by the Republican super PAC was not enough to shift the needle closer into the direction of their candidate. So in some sense, much though one regrets this huge waste of money that could be devoted to other causes, the common sense of the American people shone through in the end, and they were not unduly impressed.
That makes it all the more wasteful.
In fact, one could say they were unimpressed, and an indication of that might well be the final turnout numbers, which we haven't seen exactly what they will be, since there's still the recount in Florida, and when we went on the air, there were still a few polling or ballot offices that had not reported. But it seems they're going to be lower than not just 2008, but also 2004. Unfortunately, that's it for this week. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Jan. And thank you, Sir Michael. We hope to have you back soon, in more than a year and a half, I guess. So our listeners will have to keep listening for that. Thank you, Eddie Sanfilippo, in the background. And most importantly, thank you to all those who stayed up all night in Europe to see the results, went to work, and still managed to listen to our show. They're very devoted listeners indeed. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same channel. But if you miss it, our shows are now being archived on YouTube. www.youtube.com/user/AJC TAI. So check them out there as well. And there's some nice pictures to accompany the obviously wonderful audio. Until next week, I'm Joshua Goodman for the entire team. Good night from Counterpoint.